Welcome back to Unshakable Belief.
Welcome back to Unshakable Belief. Last week, we talked about what happens when you wake up one day and realize you don't quite feel like yourself anymore. And as I was reflecting on that episode this week, something happened that made me realize just how much I've changed over the last few years. Not in a dramatic way, not one of those movie moments where everything suddenly clicks into place, but in a quiet, subtle way. It's the kind of change you don't always notice until you're standing in the middle of a decision and you realize you're no longer making it from the same place. I think that's what growth often looks like. It's not dramatic transformation, it's tiny moments where you realize your old patterns aren't driving the bus anymore. So, I want to tell you about something that happened this week. I was invited to a Spurs watch party. Now, if you know me, you know this isn't really about basketball. The watch party isn't the point. The invitation is the point. Because for most of my life, I said yes to almost everything. Not necessarily because I wanted to go, but it'll, and not because it aligned with my priorities, but because I wanted to belong. I wanted to maintain relationships. I didn't want to disappoint people. So I didn't want to miss opportunities. I didn't want someone to stop inviting me. And I definitely didn't want anyone thinking I wasn't interested. So my default answer was yes. I don't think I'm alone in that. How many times have you looked at your calendar and realized half of the things that you have on there are because you felt guilty saying no, or because you didn't want to disappoint someone, or you were afraid of missing out? FOMO. I think a lot of women live this way, especially high capacity women. We're the ones who can handle it. We're the responsible ones. We're the dependable ones. We're the ones that people count on. And after a while, saying yes becomes automatic. We don't even stop to ask ourselves. Rather, we want to do the thing, we just do it because that's who we've always been. So when I got invited to this watch party, my first instinct was the old instinct. Yes, of course. It sounds fun. But then something interesting happened. I paused. And that pause changed everything. Instead of immediately answering, I looked at my calendar. And what I realized was I already had meaningful connection happening all month long. I had lunch plans with friends, a networking mixer, a mastermind sisterhood call, time with family in Colorado, dinner plans with friends, and additional networking opportunities that were already scheduled. My calendar wasn't lacking connection. My life wasn't lacking relationships. I wasn't lonely. I wasn't isolated. So, for the first time, I asked myself a different question. I didn't ask, can I go? I asked instead, does this serve me right now? The answer surprised me because the answer was no. Not because the event was bad and not because the people weren't wonderful, not because I didn't appreciate the invitation. The answer was no, because it didn't align with what I needed at that time. And that was a huge realization because I wasn't saying no to connection. I was saying yes to alignment. As I sat with that decision, I had another realization surface. For a long time, I thought I was saying yes because I valued connection. But when I really got honest with myself, I realized many of those yeses weren't actually about connection at all. They were about belonging. And those are not the same thing. Connection comes from authenticity. Belonging comes from feeling accepted. The problem is that when we have wounds around worthiness, visibility, rejection, or abandonment, we start chasing belonging in ways that don't actually create connection. We overextend ourselves, we overcommit, we overfunction, we become available to everyone, we become helpful to everyone, we become responsible for everyone. And underneath all of it is often an unspoken fear. What if I stop showing up and people stop wanting me around? That's not connection. That's anxiety. And I think so many women are carrying that anxiety and they don't even realize it because it looks responsible. It looks kind. It looks generous. But underneath it is a nervous system that has learned if I'm useful, I'll be loved. If I'm available, I'll belong. If I keep everyone happy, I'll be safe. And eventually you become exhausted. Not because you're doing bad things, but because you're carrying things that were never yours to carry. I think that's one of the reasons so many women feel disconnected from themselves. They've spent years responding to everyone else's needs without ever stopping to ask, what do I need? What do I want? What aligns with me? And if you're not careful, your calendar starts reflecting everybody else's priorities except your own. Your life becomes full, but it doesn't feel fulfilling. And that's a very different thing. One of the things I've been learning this year is that boundaries aren't about pushing people away. They're about creating enough space to hear yourself again. Because if every moment is filled with obligations, noise, expectations, commitments, eventually you lose access to your own voice. And then you wake up one day wondering why you don't feel like yourself anymore. The answer might be simpler than you think. Maybe you've just been listening to everyone else for so long that you stopped listening to yourself. Now, before we continue, I want to share something with you. One of the things I see over and over again with high capacity women is that they don't realize how disconnected they've become until they're exhausted. They're functioning, they're succeeding, they're handling responsibilities, but underneath it all, they feel off. That's why I'm hosting a free masterclass later this month called She Feels Off: Why High Capable Women Feel Disconnected, Exhausted, and Stuck. We're going to talk about why survival mode affects your mind, your body, your nervous system, relationships, and your sense of identity, and what you can do to begin reconnecting with yourself again. The masterclass is happening June 29th at 7 p.m. Central. I'd love for you to join me. And if you're looking for a deeper level of support, my completely redesigned reset program opens in July. It's built around the 8 pillars that help me understand that healing isn't just about mindset. It's about reconnecting your mind, your body, your emotions, your nervous system, relationships, purpose, and identity so that real transformation can happen. Now, you can find details for both of those in the show notes below. Let's get back to our conversation. What's fascinating is that the very same week I said no to the Spurs watch party, I found myself saying yes to something else. And that yes felt completely different. I will be attending the Book Thinkers event in Boston this year. And if I'm being completely honest, I wasn't immediately sold on it. There was travel involved, and I do love travel, but There was expense involved, logistics. The hotel situation was a little stressful, and the flights were a little stressful. And I found myself wondering whether it was worth it. But then I had a conversation with the host, and something shifted. The more we talked, the more excited I became. Not because of what I might get, and not because I was trying to prove something, not because I felt obligated, but because it felt aligned. I was invited to bring copies of my book, meet readers, build relationships, have meaningful conversations, and possibly speak at the event next year. Suddenly, it didn't feel like another obligation on my calendar. It felt like an opportunity connected to the future that I'm intentionally building. That's the difference. One event drained me just thinking about it. The other energized me. One felt like obligation. The other felt like alignment. I think many of us ignore that feeling. We talk ourselves out of what excites us. We talk ourselves into things we don't actually want to do because we've been trained to prioritize obligation over alignment. But what if your excitement matters? What if your curiosity matters? What if your energy is trying to tell you something? What if alignment feels different because it is different? Then there was one more realization this month, and this one caught me completely off guard. A friend of mine hosts a very high-end women's experience in Paris. It's invite only, it's intimate, it's curated, and she invited me. Now, realistically, the investment for that experience isn't something I'm prepared to make right now. So the story isn't about whether I'm going to Paris. The breakthrough wasn't the trip. The breakthrough was my reaction to the invitation. Because as soon as she invited me, I realized something had changed. For the first time in my life, I didn't question whether I belonged there. I didn't ask myself if I was successful enough, accomplished enough, smart enough, polished enough, or qualified enough. I simply received the invitation. And I don't think I realized how significant that was until later. Because if that invitation had come 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, my brain would have immediately started creating evidence for why I didn't belong. I would have looked around the room and assumed everyone else deserved to be there more than I did. I would have questioned my worth. I would have questioned my accomplishments, my success, my value. I would have assumed I was visiting someone else's world instead of realizing I had been invited into it. And as I sat with that realization, I found myself grieving a little, not because of Paris, although if you know me, you know I love Paris, but because of how many years I spent believing I had to earn belonging. How many years I spent believing visibility was something other people deserved more than I did. How many years I spent shrinking myself to fit into rooms instead of recognizing that I had something meaningful to contribute. I think so many women are doing this. We assume everyone else is more qualified, more accomplished, more confident, more deserving. Meanwhile, we are carrying wisdom, experience, resilience, and insight that other people desperately need, but we discount it because it comes naturally to us. The truth is, belonging was never something I needed to earn. I just didn't know that yet. When I look at the three experiences together, the Spurs invitation, the Boston event, and the Paris invitation, I realized they were all teaching me the same lesson. The old version of me would have asked, what should I do? The new version of me asks, what aligns with the life I'm intentionally building? It's a completely different question because one is based on external expectations. The other is based on internal truth. One is driven by fear. The other is driven by self-trust. One is about proving. The other is about becoming. And if I'm honest, I think that's what this entire season of life has been teaching me. Not just my divorce, not just my book, not just losing 170 pounds or rebuilding my health, but all of it. The lesson underneath all of it is self-trust. Learning to trust my own voice, learning to trust my own needs, learning to trust my own intuition, learning to trust that saying no doesn't make me selfish, learning to trust that saying yes doesn't require justification, learning to trust that I don't have to earn belonging. Maybe that's the question I want to leave you with today. When you look at your life, when you look at your calendar, when you look at the commitments you're making, and you look at the opportunities in front of you, are you making decisions from alignment, or are you making decisions from fear? Are you choosing connection, or are you chasing belonging? Are you honoring your own needs, or are you managing everyone else's expectations? Because here's what I'm learning. Sometimes growth looks like saying yes. Sometimes growth looks like saying no. And neither one determines your worth. The goal isn't to become available. The goal isn't to become selfish. The goal is to become honest. Honest about what you need. Honest about what aligns. Honest about what you're building and about who you're becoming. Because the more honest you become, the easier it is to hear yourself. And the easier it is to hear yourself, the easier it becomes to trust yourself. I think that's where healing begins. Not in having all the answers, not in making perfect decisions, but in learning to trust yourself enough to ask the right questions. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Share it with a friend, send me a message, or come join the conversation in the Unshakable Belief community on Facebook. If you've been feeling disconnected, exhausted, or stuck, don't forget to register for my free masterclass, She Feels Off. I will see you next week. But until then, tell the truth, choose courage, reconnect with yourself, and remember, you were made for more.